Anybody like it? Anybody shorter than me would like to join me? Good morning. Good morning. How are y'all? How you been? How about you? How about you? How about you? And how have you been? And how have you been? Well, we're working him on, right? Okay, so tell me what big holiday we just had recently. Yes, we did, didn't we? What happens at that birthday? Why do we celebrate Jesus' birthday? We're glad he's here, right? And how do we celebrate that? Get together with our families, and what else? The best part, come on. We get presents, right? So, after we have the Christmas season, then we have something called the Epiphany season, which is real short. Almost, keep that in mind. So then we have Epiphany, and it's when the wise men followed the star, right? Then comes something that starts this week. You all know what starts this week? Lent. Do you know what that means? What does it mean? Yeah, that's right. Do you all know what Lent means? Lent is the time that we remember what Jesus came for. Why did Jesus come here as a baby and then grow up and do things? Why did Jesus come? To save us from our sins, right? To make us right with God. This is a hard time to celebrate, because celebrate's the wrong word, because what are we remembering about what happened to Jesus? What happened to Jesus? He died on the cross. That's kind of hard to say the word celebrate with, isn't it? So it's okay for the next 6 weeks to just be a little bit sad about what Jesus had to go through. It's okay also to be happy that Jesus did it for us. But right now, what we're going to remember the next few weeks is what Jesus did, what it took for him to make us right with God. Okay? And this Wednesday is something called Ash Wednesday. Do you know what we do on Ash Wednesday? You come up to the church and I take some ashes and I put them on your forehead. And I say, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Just to remember that this is not the last place we are. The last place we are is heaven. Thank you. Have a good week. In just a short time, our readings each week have taken us from the end of the Christmas stories right into Lent. Today's story stands poised like at the crest of a hill, and oh, the difference a few weeks can make. Let's face it right off. The Transfiguration, when taken at face value and out of context, is the single strangest story this side of the empty tomb. To put this event into perspective, to understand why it stands like a bookend on this side of the Lenten narratives as the empty tomb is the other bookend, we must first grasp the movement of Jesus' understanding about his own ministry, and secondly, begin to see today's text as an affirmation of a decision that Jesus had to come to. So often, looking back on Jesus' ministry and life, equipped with the resurrection stories, we see only Jesus the divine. But that's a little like reading a murder mystery, knowing ahead of time who done it and how it was done. Anyone can then be an expert at finding the clues, in this case, divine clues. But a note for you for Lent. This year, pretend you don't know that he's going to die. Pretend that you don't know anything about empty tombs. Let the clues mount as they develop. Try it once. Make it your Lenten sacrifice. Instead of giving up chocolate for Lent, this year give up the resurrection until it actually happens in the sequence of events. Anyway, we are often, it seems, stuck in our divine Jesus mode. But our confession is that Jesus was also fully human. And that is terribly important to remember. If Jesus was only God playing human, then his struggle and pain would only be a charade. If you will, it's not Jesus, the divine chess master, who knows every move before it is made, but more like Jesus playing high-stakes poker, in which the outcome is genuinely in question until the last card is played. To see the transition in Jesus' ministry, one must note that in the beginning he presents himself as what one would expect from a Messiah. What I mean is that he exorcises demons, gives sight to the blind, makes the lame walk, heals lepers, restores hearing to the deaf, raises the dead, proclaims good news to the poor. And not only that, but he teaches as one who has direct authority from God. In short, he is this wonder-working rabbi to whom at least the common folk are drawn. But remember, even in this early stage, that he also indulges in some un-Messiah-like behavior, and this eventually upsets those in religious authority. He breaks Sabbath, he associates with tax collectors and prostitutes, he develops a reputation for enjoying parties and drinking wine. In general, Jesus sits noticeably distant from those law-abiding expectations that the Jewish establishment has for a proper Messiah. As a matter of fact, as early as the 3rd chapter of Mark, there's talk about killing Jesus. So let it be said that from the beginning, Jesus the human is trying to bring his ministry into focus, to find what is unique, to define his special gifts and his calling from God. So now let the events unfold as they're actually played up to the Transfiguration. The way is open to review the events just prior to today's text. In order, they are the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water, the predictions of his death and resurrection, and then the Transfiguration. In these events, we see Jesus is thinking about his own mission. So let's take the generalities first. Consider the obvious fact that the tone of Jesus' ministry changes radically after the Transfiguration. From that point on, the Messiah who began his career as a wonder worker does fewer and fewer miracles and indulges in far less purely ethical discourse. More than that, the largely upbeat style of his early ministry is replaced by setting his face toward Jerusalem, that is, toward his coming death. There is harder evidence. Consider the feeding of the 5,000. After a long day in a deserted spot, a day in which Jesus occupied himself with the old-style healing and preaching that had marked his ministry so far, the disciples come to him and suggest dismissing the crowd so that the people can go and get something to eat. At first, Jesus seems hardly to have heard them. "You feed them," he says. It is only after they have nattered on about the cost of such a project that Jesus begins to concern himself with the problem. With an air of grudging involvement, he says, "Go see how much bread you have." Even then, his concern manifests itself in an almost minimal way. He simply takes the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that they found, gives thanks, and proceeds to have the disciples distribute the food. The miracle is about as understated as it possibly can be. Jesus, from start to finish, seems largely out of it. Not only that, but when the miracle is over and everyone has finally caught on to what has happened, it looks for all the world as if he cannot get away from the scene fast enough. Jesus dismisses both the disciples and the crowd and goes up on the mountain by himself. John's gospel actually gives the reason for this retreat. Jesus knew they were going to come and seize him in order to make him king. Jesus seems to be having second thoughts about the style of his ministry so far and goes off to wrestle with these doubts in prayer. And pray he does, for most of the night, in fact. Then, in a scene that has a dreamlike quality, he comes walking to his disciples on the water in a storm. The usual interpretation of this scene is that he was coming to their aid, but Mark 6 says that he was going to pass them by, suggesting once again that Jesus was less involved in their problems than in his own. In any event, the disciples end up more afraid of Jesus than they were of the storm. The impression given by the account is that something darkly mysterious was preoccupying not just his mind, but his entire being. The disciples seem to have been responding more to that mystery than to the sudden calming of the storm. They were, as Mark 6 says, completely amazed and utterly confused because they did not understand about the loaves and their hearts were hardened. Obviously, it is possible to interpret this last comment as meaning that having failed to grasp the first miracle, they likewise failed to grasp the second. And that's possible, but it's hardly likely. The disciples had already seen Jesus do enough signs and wonders to keep them from that kind of pointlessness. No, their incomprehension was caused not by their inability to know a miracle when they saw one, but by something else emanating straight from Jesus himself. He was being weird. He was, for all his visibility, off their mental radar screens. This change in Jesus after the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on the water is underscored in John, the 6th chapter. The next day, as John has it, the crowd catches up with Jesus in Capernaum, on the other side of the lake. They too are puzzled, specifically by the fact that Jesus seems to have made the crossing without using the only available boat. Rabbi, they ask, when did you get here? Jesus' response only adds to their confusion. He first launches into a comment on the unworthiness of their motives in seeking him, and then in reply to their plausible, sincere questions, Jesus indulges himself in a series of progressively obscure answers. What they really want, as John has already noted, is to make him king. But they also hope that he will claim for himself the kind of kingship they had in mind. Accordingly, having just witnessed the sign in the feeding of 5,000 people, they began asking Jesus bread from heaven questions, designed to elicit the desired response from him. Our fathers ate manna in the desert, they say, obviously expecting Jesus to pick up on the lead and come out with a punchline worthy of the Messiah, an updated version of the kind of plausible salvation that they know and love for generations. But Jesus gives them nothing for their comfort. He tells them that not only did Moses not give them bread from heaven, but that the true bread from heaven is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The rest of the dialogue proceeds in the same way. They ask sensible, leading questions, and Jesus gives strange, vague, unsatisfactory answers. He promises resurrection at the last day. He affirms that he is the living bread, that the bread he gives is his flesh. He ends with the assertion that unless they eat his flesh and drink his blood, they cannot have life. Finally, not only the crowd, but also many of Jesus' followers simply go away, no longer walk with him. In short, in his references to flesh and blood, he has broached the subject of the death of the Messiah. And the weirdness of it all simply puts them off. Even the 12, who do in fact remain with him, stay on only in a dumb, desperate, who else can we go kind of way. Look next at Peter's confession and note how it brings together all of the elements of Jesus' unique messiahship, his bizarre linking of that messiahship to his own death and resurrection. The passage begins with Jesus asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answer, "John the Baptist, or Elijah, or one of the prophets." In other words, they tell Jesus that he is being taken for someone who is part of the old, credible, logical order of things. Jesus then asks them who they say he is, and Peter answers, "The Christ." But Jesus rebukes them all, telling them not to talk to anyone about him. Presumably, he does this to stop them from broadcasting their own old-style version of a Messiah. And he follows it up by predicting in plain words his coming death and resurrection. Peter, in turn, proving that Jesus was right not to trust the disciples' understanding of Messiahship, rebukes Jesus. Peter simply cannot stand such down talk from someone he has just proclaimed the Messiah. So Jesus once again rebukes Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan," telling him that he is out of step with God's way of doing this Messiah business. The whole exchange produces this exact same reading on the weirdness scale as did the dialogue in John 6. It shows Jesus as a dying and rising Messiah who fits no previous mold for a Messiah. And it continues to stress the changes he has been manifesting all through this sequence. Which brings us to the capstone of the entire series of events, the transfiguration of Jesus. As I have said, except for the resurrection itself, the transfiguration is the single strangest event in Jesus' ministry. It sets together once again the theme of old order versus new order, and the theme of death as the key to Jesus' messiahship. And the first of these is evidenced by three details. It is Moses and Elijah, old order figures, who speak with Jesus. Second, Peter suggests building 3 tents, indicating that he could think of no way to commemorate the event other than with a ritual from the old religion. And third, God, apparently out of sheer impatience with the disciples' failure to grasp this new order in Jesus, simply drops a cloud on a lot of them and tells them to shut up and pay attention to his son. The theme of death is manifested by Mark's report that Jesus ordered the disciples to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. So in this text today, we have the transition from Jesus' early ministry to his walk toward Jerusalem. We have the transition from old-style Messiah to a God who saves by raising the dead. Let our Lenten walk begin. Amen.